But I think we were just set up to be unsuccessful by not having the proper training, by not being from the community we were trying to serve. I think the model needs to change. Our students of color don't stand a chance if they're relegated to the least trained teachers.
Welcome to the 6th episode of Truth for America. My name is Julian Vasquez Heilig, and I am a professor of educational leadership and policy studies at California State, Sacramento. I'm really excited today to have my co-host, Jameson Brewer, and also two former TFA alums, Terinda White and Jesse Hagopian. Today we are going to talk about Teach for America and diversity. There's been lots of conversations in the media, lots of conversations in TFA's marketing materials that diversity is a priority of the organization nowadays. The new CEO, Eliza Villanueva-Beard, has prioritized diversity in the core. And so we wanted to bring on Jesse Hagopian and Terinda to talk about their perspective. So I'd like to go ahead and have the folks on the podcast today introduce themselves. Tell us what year and city they were in Teach for America.
Sure, I am Jameson Brewer. I'm a recent PhD graduate from the University of Illinois, where I also serve as the O'Leary Fellow at the Forum on the Future of Public Education. I'm a traditionally trained teacher, but I joined Teach for America during the recession to find a job. I was a 2010 Metro Atlanta Corps member.
Yeah, my name is Jesse Hagopian. I was a 2001 Corps member in Washington, D.C., and did the 2 years of the Teach for America program there, and taught a third year there, and then returned to my hometown of Seattle and got my master's degree in teaching, and have been teaching ever since, and also serve as an editor for Rethinking Schools magazine.
Thank you. Terinda?
Yeah, my name is Terinda White. So I did Teach for America in 2002, and I was in Los Angeles, particularly in the Linwood Unified School District, which is South LA. And I also did 3 years teaching elementary school out there and earned a master's at Loyola Marymount University. And then I left and went to graduate school at Columbia and did a PhD to sort of understand education policy. And so I'm a professor today at the University of Colorado Boulder in education policy and practice.
Thank you. So I want to get started today talking about diversity in Teach for America. Of course, some of the latest news out of Teach for America is that they're saying that they're prioritizing diversity in their core. Now, in the first episode of Truth for America, we of course heard from a principal who talked about how in her Houston high school that they did not have much diversity. And as one of the summer sites for Teach for America, they didn't have much diversity in the core. Terinda White recently had an interview with Ed Shyster, also known as Jennifer Berkshire, about diversity in Teach for America. So what do you think about, each of you, what do you think about this new focus of Teach for America on diversity? One of the critiques for decades of Teach for America was that they were very white and very Ivy League. What do you think about this new diversity conversation that they've tried to get started?
So I'll go first, and I'll say I think context matters. So whatever the numbers are, so I think they are sort of celebrating upwards of 40% of their core. But you have to really understand, what is that 40%, what does that mean if you break that down? What percentage of African American teachers, Latino teachers, Asian American teachers, and then most importantly, what is the context? So what does that look like in Houston, in Chicago, in DC, in other places? Those are, aggregated numbers, but I'm always curious, what does that look like at the local level? And I come from this issue of relational thinking, which is something that I was sort of talking with Jameson about earlier. Some of the cities in which they're placing Corps members in, the diversity there is much, much higher. We're talking, the students that they're serving are upwards of 80-90% students of color. So what does that 40% look like? Or even if you break that down, 20% or 15% or 10%, what does that still look like in a particular city and a local level?
It's an excellent point. One of the things we talked about before we came on was that in New Orleans and in Chicago, Teach for America has really, at the same time as they're talking about diversity, they've displaced hundreds and hundreds of black teachers in those cities, which is really disconcerting.
Well, absolutely, and I think that Tarenda made that point well in the interview she did with EduShyster, that it's actually a laudable goal to increase diversity of TFA and something that is important and an important goal for them to have. But as she said, the context matters. And if you're displacing large numbers of veteran African American teachers in places like New Orleans or in Chicago, where many of the schools have been privatized into charter schools and then are supplied with the reserve army of TFA teachers, you have to look at what the overall impact on the diversity of the city's teaching corps is beyond TFA when taking into account the displacement of educators as well. In addition to that, I would say that diversity of the teaching force is an important goal, but I think another important goal that they haven't laid out is actually having an anti-racist teaching force, right? To have conscious programs of educating teachers to teach against institutional racism. And that's not a conversation that is really, I think, taken to the level it needs to in TFA. It wasn't for me as a 2001 Corps member. In fact, one of my black Corps members who raised this issue over and over at our TFA teacher boot camp, that 5-week training program we were in, he raised this over and over again. When are we going to study institutional racism and why the places we are going to are poor in the first place? So we can help teach the kids about why they're facing racism and poverty. And every time he raised that, it created more discomfort until he was put on a performance plan. And when you're put on a performance plan, there's such an incredible extra amount of work that has to be done. It's really almost impossible, at least it was for him, to do the performance plan work and the boot camp of teaching summer school and going to all these classes, and it basically forced him out. And that really opened my eyes to the program in a different way. I joined because I was told I was going to be part of a civil rights movement, and it was exciting to me, and I liked that message. But when I had that experience with someone on my floor at our training being what I thought was pushed out for wanting a more systematic analysis of racism to be part of our teaching, it really raised a lot of issues for me.
So, Jesse, you and Tarenda, for me, bring up some important points. And, Jesse, you talk about the importance of Corps members, or really in general, teachers having anti-racist dispositions. I wonder if you could each talk about, Tarenda, you talk about the geographic context and how that's important here when we're looking at questions about TFA's diversity. I wonder if you could go deeper with the pedagogical context. So each of you, it seems to me that a lot of Teach for America's approach to pedagogy and classroom management tends to elevate and support a sort of white cultural assumption about, how students are supposed to behave, how they learn, and what success looks like. So does Teach for America have to forego their historical approach to education and pedagogy this way before they can really embrace an anti-racist disposition?
Well, they might be related, right? So a part of the diversity, one of the weaknesses in sort of having this sort of undefined diversity in terms of numbers and not, as Jesse said, sort of thinking about anti-racism. A part of that is also being able to understand the history that shaped the conditions of the schools in which the teachers are working in which the teachers and the students are sort of living and going to school in, right? So it matters to have a teacher who maybe sort of grounded in a historical understanding of the history of racism as it plays out in that community or some of the issues that that community is facing. So local roots and having relationships with teachers who may be connected to what's happening in New Orleans and can speak to the cultural sort of traditions in those neighborhoods. I mean, how do you have a culturally relevant pedagogical approach when you don't have a sense of context and history and understanding of that community? And so I think it's important to be anti-racist and to then think about what that means pedagogically. But then I always come back to that means having a sense of context and being able to sort of speak to and understand children as nested in communities that have a history, both a history of sort of organizing for concerns and issues and sort of what is education for liberation, what does that mean in that context, and can you speak to that, and however you organize your teaching and learning. But context and history matter to be culturally relevant, I would think, and to be anti-racist.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I think that's a great point, because my experience going into Washington, D.C., as a Black teacher going down to Anacostia, in a 100% segregated school, right? 100% African American kids. But just because I was also African American didn't mean that I knew what they were going through in Anacostia. Growing up in Seattle is a very different context. And I didn't know the historical intricacies of the way institutional racism was constructed in the nation's capital with such proximity to power. And, I learned way more than I taught. As someone with 5 weeks of training, I was told I was going to go in there and solve all sorts of problems. But in fact, what happened was I learned about just how unequal our society is, that I could drive by the White House and then 10 minutes later be in a section of the city that's been completely cut off from any resources systematically. There was a hole in the ceiling of my classroom, and it just rained into my room and destroyed the first project I ever assigned to the kids. So I learned about what neglect and underfunding of the schools could look like and the impact it had on the kids. But in terms of my ability to teach them or understand how that process worked in their neighborhood, I was unequipped. And I would say that Teach for America's philosophy in terms of what they value is raising test scores is really important. I was told that. And if that's your approach to pedagogy, then the problem with that is undoing institutional racism is not on the test. So if you're teaching to the test, it's very hard to help the students understand why there's a hole in their ceiling and why in the world's most powerful capital they can't figure out how to have a library with books from the current decade. Those kind of questions aren't on the test. And so the hyper achievement culture and the need for Teach for America to show they're successful by raising test scores means that engaging kids in deeper conversations about our society, having them critically think about their position in society and power really just wasn't a priority. And I think that would have to completely change for Teach for America to be a liberatory institution. And I think that's just something that they're not committed to because, they take a whole lot of money from corporations that benefit from the current order of having extreme amounts of wealth concentrated in very few hands. And I don't think that Teach for America is an organization that fundamentally wants to upset that order and empower students to solve the problems in their community.
So, one of the things that happened maybe some time ago, Michelle Malkin, she's often on Fox News, wrote a critical piece about Teach for America, and basically around the fact that Brittany and D-Ray, they were on the front lines of the protests in St. Louis and in Missouri. And I tweeted something very simple that day about how the elites, or if the right wing turned on Teach for America, that it would be a big problem for them, dovetailing with what Jesse was just talking about. And then I received these tweets from Brittany saying, well, we believe in the same things, and I've lost respect for you because you agreed with what Michelle Malkin said. And what I explained to her was I didn't agree that it was an issue that some Teach for America alums were agitating for social justice. My critique was that Teach for America has essentially become an arm of private control through a variety of mechanisms, whether they be charter schools or even the private provision of teachers to communities, which I think gets at the heart of the conversation that you're having. When Teach for America wanted to go into Santa Ana, California, recently, the community got together on social media and fought back, and now Teach for America is not in Santa Ana. And one of the teachers and parents in that town, in Santa Ana, talked about how they really wanted teachers from Santa Ana in Teach for America, because then those teachers would have connections to the community and not be temporary in that community or parachute into that community, which sort of gets at Jesse's concern. Even as a teacher of color, the historical context of Washington, D.C. is somewhat different than, or quite different than Seattle. So the question is, could a district say to Teach for America, you know what, we really like the idea that you are focusing on diversity, but we want you to focus on the diverse populations of students that are from our community and recruit those teachers so that they stay in our community. Do you think Teach for America would say yes to that?
I would say probably that would upset their model, and they probably wouldn't go for that. I feel like that would be a better reform, but then if they're recruiting teachers from that area, then why would those teachers need to go to Teach for America? Why not teaching program where they have more than 5 weeks of training? I mean, I think that there's a fundamental flaw in the belief that at-risk students, students of color, low-income students should have the least experienced teaching force, have the least trained teaching force. I think that even if the teachers are from the local population, 5 weeks is not enough time to learn how to hold an effective Socratic seminar, structured academic controversy, how to scaffold lessons to build up to higher order thinking skills, how to engage students in debates around issues that they face in their community, and build trust with students to the point where you can have safe debates. And that takes time, and it takes mentorship of teachers that know how to do that. And it wasn't until I was able to do my master's degree and actually work with mentor teachers over time that I could begin to develop some of those skills, or even that I knew those were important skills to have in the first place.
So you're saying that maybe reforming Teach for America around the margins doesn't get at the real core issues that Terenda, you've written about, Jameson, you've written about, Jesse, you've written about. Does that sound like what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Julian, that Teach for America, I think, is part of a broader nexus of privatization. I don't think you can see Teach for America isolated from the broader agenda of those who promote charter schools, high-stakes testing, and the general undermining of teachers' unions and privatization. You know, the same folks funding TFA are funding those other initiatives for a reason. They would never dream for their own kids of having a teacher with 5 weeks experience come teach their kids. But for poor black and brown children, they should be grateful that there's a teacher who has a lot of initiative and wants to go help, and that's great. I've worked with many Teach for America teachers who did have a lot of initiative and did want to help, and I have a lot of respect for my colleagues who were trying their best in the program, but I think we were just set up to be unsuccessful by not having the proper training, by not being from the community we were trying to serve. I think the model needs to change.
No, I think for them to really value that model, or to really reframe their model, they would have to get at the core issue of a community community-based and sustainable model of schooling, like a school community, and they have those terms. If you go to their website, and they have these sort of values of sustainability, but what does that mean for the model? I don't necessarily see that integrated into the model. So wanting teachers from the communities or developing teachers from the communities that they're going to teach in requires valuing that sort of connection, that connectivity over time, and thinking of teaching as a profession and not sort of this thing that you do on your way to something else. And I think they have historically promoted an indifference to retention. I think now they say that we're no longer indifferent to retention. Well, that's progress, I guess, but why wouldn't retention be, why wouldn't having teachers as professionals, as a career, why was that not a part of the model originally? And why is moving them on to quote unquote better things, why is that okay? So I think the term community sustainability can lend itself to wanting to, bring teachers from communities to teach in those schools, but the model itself isn't necessarily grounded in a community-based, sustainable idea of teaching. Where schools are community, they are part of those communities.
If I could just jump on at the end of that, I completely agree, and I would just add that I think part of the reason why Teach for America has made space for itself and has grown so much is because there is a real problem in the public schools. They haven't always served our kids, and especially our students of color and low-income students. There's been systematic approach to undermine the school's ability to serve the kids who need the most help. And so in that crisis, they can say, see, the current system isn't working, we're going to come in and solve it. And so I would say that it's not enough just to oppose Teach for America. I think their model is fundamentally flawed and part of a broader privatization agenda. But even if we defeat TFA, we're not serving all of our kids, and we do need to talk about retooling our traditional teacher education programs as well to be able to meet the needs of students. I think too often our traditional teacher education programs are being bullied and cajoled into some of the same myths around the importance of high-stakes testing, right? Standardized testing having its roots in the eugenics movement here in the United States that developed these tests in order to prove white supremacy, and that was a conscious project of people like Carl Brigham who invented the SAT exam. And now, too often, in all forms of teacher training programs, we're told that the key to supporting students of color is to have them score better on the exams and teach to the test. And that's a problem anywhere it's happening, inside TFA and out. It's just that our students of color don't stand a chance if they're relegated to the least trained teachers.
So it seems to me, and Trina brought this up about the importance of community-based education and learning, and Jesse talked about raising up teachers, who are not only familiar with the community, but from the community. As we all know, Teach for America just last week or the week before, I think, talking about massive layoffs at the national level. They're getting rid of their chief diversity officer. They're saying that they're going to locate diversity issues at the local level. And so do you see this as a point where Teach for America may pivot and make meaningful changes, or do you think that because they're underneath so much scrutiny, especially over the past couple of years, that we're going to see Teach for America double down on their focus on increasing test scores and using that as the metric by which they try to justify their existence?
I think they might do a sort of double approach. Like, I do think that there are those within the organization who are hearing the scrutiny or hearing the concerns and criticisms. And I do see these sort of pilot programs that are, trying to extend the 5 weeks of training so that you maybe recruit the juniors in college to maybe start the program early so that they have more training, or I see sort of culturally relevant consultants or consultants who sort of do culturally relevant teaching and learning. And I see enough signals that would indicate meaningful pivots, as Jameson said. But the donors and the network and this sort of expansion goal and this idea to prove core members are quote unquote better than district teachers. There's a competitiveness for funds and for spotlight that I think would continue this focus on testing and test scores and sort of proving that we can raise test scores and that would then legitimate more funding and private donations or whatever. as well as these other initiatives that seem pretty marginal and peripheral, but enough to perhaps signal to those of us like myself who are concerned about these other things. I think they're doing a sort of a double approach, but I unfortunately think that the sort of ramping up or sort of proving its existence via test scores and this competitive drive is the more sort of, that to me seems the bigger focus of the org. I don't think that's going to change.
I'm just really blown away by each of your thoughtfulness about this very important issue, Teach for America and diversity. I think that we've taken this conversation to a different place than we've seen in the past in conversations around Teach for America. So I just want to give each of you just 30 seconds to conclude this, our 6th episode of Truth for America.
Yeah, I just want to conclude. I just want people to understand that TFA is as powerful in its sort of recruit. Like, you know, they sort of, most people understand TFA as a recruitment and placement or teacher preparation organization, but they are heavy advocates of particular policies. And so I just want people to think about what their policy advocacy work means for diversity as they tout sort of numbers about diversity among corps members. But what policies are they supporting, and what do those policies mean for teachers of color broadly? And I think we have to connect the dots there, that there may be a huge contradiction in how educators of color are experiencing the kinds of policies that TFA has been supporting. And that, to me, is not supporting diversity.
I would add that I'm really encouraged to see what's become a growing movement of TFA alums speaking back about the program that they went through and some of its fundamental shortcomings. Books like Learning from Counter Narratives and Teach for America by Sarah Matsui have come out to give voice to TFA alums who have thought through their experience and realized that it's going to take a lot more to shake the foundations of institutional racism than undertrained teachers, however diverse, coming into our most needy schools. And, you know, we're seeing more and more organization and activity of these alums, and I think that's what it's going to take to fundamentally challenge the model of TFA that is so integrated into the larger privatization agenda. And when you look at the way TFA has served the expansion of charter schools or supported charter schools, you have to think about the high rates of push out in those schools of students of color, right? The zero tolerance programs that have dramatically disproportionately suspended students of color in those programs are being allowed to continue by the larger apparatus of corporate reform that includes TFA. And so it's not enough to just diversify your teaching force if you're supporting charter school programs that are disproportionately suspending students of color. I think that's fundamentally flawed, and we have to build a social justice reform movement that sees all these things connected and unites parents, students, and teachers for a much bigger vision of what our public schools could be about in terms of empowering students to challenge problems they face in their community, not just preparing for the next exam.
Great, and I'd like to thank both Jesse and Turinda for coming on with us for this podcast. A little shameless plug for the book that I co-edited with Kathleen. In fact, Turinda has a chapter in our book. It's Beyond Dupes, Disciples, and Dilettantes, Ideological Struggles of Teach for America Corps members. And she, in her chapter, she gives voice to a handful of Corps members of color that are often, and I agree with Jesse, the importance of growing tide of critique, I think, in certainly in different ways, but more importantly, first into the light, into the public sphere. And so for me, I really hope that Teach for America's changes, or at least in this opportunity, if that's what we want to call what they have at this moment, that changes are actually genuine and meaningful, right? That it's not empty or surface level rhetoric. I think that the organization is really going to have to reevaluate their approach to pedagogy and classroom management that has historically elevated a very white cultural assumption, or the assumption about culture success. And I think that that's something they're going to have to deal with, and time will tell.
Well, I think each of you have been very thoughtful talking about Teach for America's role in the broader privatization and private control movement. I think you've been very thoughtful in talking about how reforms around the margins don't address the institutional racism in our society, and sending teachers who have very little training to our most vulnerable students is not a civil rights movement.